How U.S. President Donald Trump has been facing political pressure in his own country as the Democrats have now escalated efforts to question his fitness for office. While more than 85 House and Senate Democrats are now calling for Trump to be either impeached or removed through the 25th Amendment. This move comes after Trump's recent remarks, including a whole civilization will die tonight, in a clear reference to Iran. Lawmakers have now introduced a striking proposal tied to the 25th Amendment, aiming to create a formal mechanism to assess whether Donald Trump can still serve. Under the proposal, congressional leaders will each appoint 2 members. It would include 4 former high-ranking executive branch officials, specifically vice presidents, secretaries of state, defense and treasury, attorneys general, and, of course, surgeon generals. The panel will include a final chair as well, selected by the commission itself, potentially a physician or a senior statesperson.
What's happening, friends? Jack Mockler. Here, a wave of congressional pressure for Trump's removal has erupted, with over 70 Democratic lawmakers publicly calling for impeachment or the 25th Amendment following his inflammatory Iran threats. While this is a documented and significant institutional revolt, it remains less conclusive than dramatic headlines suggest. The pressure is real and extensive, but actual removal is far from certain. Individual senators have stepped forward and publicly called for 25th Amendment removal by name, citing Trump's own statements as the specific evidence of unfitness for office. These are not anonymous sources or off-the-record comments. These are elected officials standing in front of cameras and microphones, invoking the most extreme constitutional mechanisms available for removing a sitting president.
But removing Donald Trump remains unlikely, as this process requires the vice president, in this case of J.D. Vance, to agree with the commission's findings. Congress will then need a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers to make any removal permanent. Now, the 25th Amendment, remember, was formulated in 1967 after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It ensures a legal mechanism designating a head of state when the president is disabled or dead. It also includes provisions for both voluntary and involuntary removal of a president. The 25th Amendment was used by George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan for medical treatment. Now, supporters argue this legislation is about preparedness and not politics. The proposal comes as the Senate votes on Wednesday to curb Trump's Iran war powers and ahead of the November midterms that will determine Trump's power in the final 2 years of his presidency.
During the January 6th fallout, the last time removal pressure reached its most acute institutional expression in American politics, at least 90 Democrats were on record calling for Trump to be stripped of office, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, personally demanding his immediate removal in the days immediately following the attack on the Capitol. That documented historical context matters enormously for evaluating where the current pressure actually sits on the spectrum of removal accountability in Trump's political history. The current wave is not as large as the January 6th wave, but it is larger than any other removal pressure moment in between. The streets of America haven't just filled up with protesters, they have overflowed.
And my colleague Susan Tehrani joins us live from New York at the moment to get us more on this. Susan, the Democrats, of course, upping the ante against Donald Trump as far as the Iran war is concerned. There is a lot of talk about the 25th Amendment being used. Get us more on how, now, of course, the opposition Democrats are planning to take this forward.
Yeah, this is just another, to be honest, blockbuster production brought to you by the same people that carried out 2 impeachments against the president during his first term, and then that January 6th commission that just dragged on, and an absolute nothing burger, for a lack of a better term, to waste everyone's time and resources. As you mentioned, the 25th Amendment was put forth in case a president gets assassinated, is sick, is injured. It wasn't put forth for someone to be removed from office because the other party simply doesn't agree with their policies. And as you mentioned, it's not only that both houses are controlled by the Republicans right now, the Democrats know this isn't going to go anywhere.
From New York City to tiny towns in deep red states, over 3,000 protests erupted across the country. Organizers say up to 9 million people joined these demonstrations. That's not a protest. That's a national uprising. This anger didn't emerge from nowhere. People are raging over immigration crackdowns, economic policies that are squeezing their livelihoods, and the increasingly authoritarian rhetoric coming from the White House. The protest movement has become a massive, visible, and impossible to ignore backdrop to the congressional pressure wave. Every day brings new images of crowds chanting and carrying signs.
But is J.D. Vance going to come on board? Is the president's entire cabinet going to come on board? They have to come on board as well. So they know that this is not going to get anywhere, but unfortunately decided to take this course as opposed to more important issues put forth after they had a long recess for Easter. And the first thing that they did, they decided to put on something and put forth something that is absolutely not going to go through. So a lot of Americans are frustrated, understandably, right now. They want Congress to work for them, and they believe that because this is just absolutely, just unlawful in many ways, it's just going to be a waste of time. But it is going to, heat up the midterms and the conversation around that. So the Democrats are hoping they can change the conversation regarding that.
Demanding accountability from their elected representatives. Every night brings new coverage of demonstrations in cities both large and small. And every single one of those protesters is sending a message to their members of Congress that the status quo is simply not acceptable. Now, let's be completely straight about the headline, because honesty is the foundational commitment of honest journalism. There is no verified report that exactly 40 sitting senators have jointly filed a single formal new demand for Trump's immediate removal in a documented group action. The headline that has been circulating takes the larger total number that includes House members, misattributes it as applying specifically to senators only, and frames the distributed individual calls as a unified formal demand rather than the distributed wave of individual public statements that the documented record actually shows. That specific combination of numerical misattribution and formalization of what was actually distributed individual action is the precise gap between the headline and the documented reality. And that gap matters not because the real documented pressure is insignificant. It is significant and deserves serious attention. But accurate numbers and accurate characterization of the nature of the pressure is essential for evaluating whether removal is actually close to happening or remains a politically significant but institutionally distant possibility. The bundling is the dramatization. The underlying distributed wave of genuine institutional pressure is real, documented, and significant. Understanding both what is real and what has been dramatized beyond the documented record is the most honest and most useful approach to the story. The real documented version is already consequential enough to deserve the serious examination it warrants without the fictional 40-senator amplification added on top of it. Over 70 legislators, including several senators, have publicly called for removal. That's a real and documented number that represents genuine institutional expression of removal pressure going beyond normal partisan opposition. Calling for the most extreme constitutional mechanisms of presidential removal is not routine political opposition. It is a specific formal constitutional claim that conduct has crossed a threshold requiring the most serious available institutional response. The specific NBC reporting deserves careful examination for what it actually established versus what the dramatic headline implies. NBC reported that over 70 legislators, including several senators, urged Trump's cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment and Congress to reconvene to pass impeachment articles and remove him. Over 70, including several senators, publicly calling for the most extreme constitutional mechanisms available for removing a sitting president. That is genuinely significant institutional language. But notice the precise formulation. Over 70 legislators, including several senators, not 40 senators specifically. The total number exceeds 40 only when House members are included in the count alongside senators. The Senate-specific number, just senators, is significantly lower than 40. The headline takes the larger total number that includes House members, misattributes it as applying specifically to senators only, and frames the distributed individual calls as a unified formal demand. Senator Markey's specific 25th Amendment call is the clearest documented example of a sitting senator publicly naming the constitutional mechanism, naming the specific constitutional standard, and naming the specific evidence that justifies invoking it. Markey publicly called for using the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office. He said the president is unfit. He cited Trump's own statements as the evidence of that unfitness. That is a sitting United States senator invoking the specific constitutional mechanism designed for situations where the president is unable to discharge the duties of his office and saying publicly that the current president meets that standard. That is more than routine partisan opposition. That is a formal public constitutional claim made by an elected official whose constitutional role includes the potential future exercise of the 25th Amendment's congressional phase. The specific evidence being cited is not criminal conduct or abuse of power in the traditional impeachment sense, but unfitness demonstrated through Trump's own words about annihilating civilizations and the broader pattern of conduct we have documented across this series. Fitness evidence that reflects a specific constitutional argument rather than a generic political opposition position. A sitting senator going on the record to say the President of the United States is unfit and citing the 25th Amendment by name, over 70 of his colleagues backing some form of removal. That is the real documented pressure wave that the dramatic headline is built around. It is genuinely significant without the specific numerical claim that the documented record does not support. The accurate numbers tell a more complex and more honest story than the dramatized 40 senators claim. They tell you that the removal pressure is real and politically significant, while the institutional threshold for actual removal is very far from being reached by the current documented pressure. Let's dig into the full substance of what the documented removal pressure actually looks like, because there are several layers here, and each one matters for the complete picture. We need to examine the specific Iran trigger, the historical context of January 6th, the constitutional arithmetic of what actual removal requires, the specific 25th Amendment dynamics, and what the full picture means for evaluating where congressional accountability pressure on Trump actually stands. Each of these elements contributes to a more complete understanding of a situation that is far more nuanced than the dramatic headlines suggest. Starting with the specific trigger, Trump's Iran language, understanding what specifically prompted over 70 lawmakers to publicly call for removal helps evaluate both the seriousness of the calls and the constitutional framing of the pressure that has followed. Trump's statements about Iran that generated the most recent removal demands included the whole civilization dying tonight language and the annihilation framing that we have covered extensively. His messaging on Iran has been characterized by extraordinary and documented internal contradictions, including the specific social media post in which he threatened the destruction of a civilization in one paragraph, and then in the same document closed with "God bless the great people of Iran." The military leadership was warning of catastrophic consequences while Trump was pushing attack plans. His victory claims were being contradicted by the documented reality on the ground. The civilization will die language coming in this broader context of Iran war management that raises its own serious questions is what over 70 lawmakers specifically cited when they called for removal. The specific constitutional mechanism they invoked, the 25th Amendment as well as impeachment, reflects a deliberate argument that this language demonstrates unfitness for office in the constitutional sense, rather than simply representing policy disagreement or even abuse of power in the traditional impeachment sense. The fitness argument is constitutionally distinct. It addresses not just what the president did, but whether the president is able to discharge the duties of the office without endangering the country. The specific evidence being marshaled, the annihilation language, the civilization, and blessing contradiction in the same post, the Iran messaging chaos, is fitness evidence that the 25th Amendment is specifically designed to address. This represents a significant evolution in how Trump's most vocal critics are constructing the constitutional case for his removal. The historical trajectory of removal pressure waves in Trump's political career places the current over 70 lawmakers wave In context, that is essential for evaluating both the significance of the current pressure and how far it is from the institutional outcomes that actual removal would require. The January 6th removal pressure was the most intense, the most bipartisan, and the most institutionally developed removal push in the entire history of Trump's political career. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, the most senior Democrats in both chambers, personally demanded his immediate removal in the days immediately after the Capitol attack. At least 90 Democrats were on record. 10 House Republicans crossed party lines to vote for impeachment, the most bipartisan House impeachment vote in American history. 7 Republican senators voted to convict, the most bipartisan Senate conviction vote ever recorded in an impeachment proceeding. Despite all of that, the Capitol attacked, Democratic leadership calling for immediate removal, 10 Republican House members crossing over, 7 Republican senators voting to convict. The Senate two-thirds threshold was not reached. 57 conviction votes against the 67 required, 10 votes short. Even at the peak of the most bipartisan, most institutionally advanced, most emotionally charged removal push in Trump's political history, the constitutional threshold held. The current over 70 lawmakers, including several senators, wave is significant, but it is smaller in absolute numbers than the January 6th total. It is less bipartisan, reflecting Democratic pressure rather than the cross-partisan alignment that January 6th produced at the margins. And it is less institutionally developed, focused on public statements and 25th Amendment invocations rather than the formal House impeachment articles that the January 6th effort produced and passed. Understanding that trajectory contextualizes the current pressure as politically significant, while making clear that the path from current pressure to actual removal is longer and steeper than the dramatic headline implies. The constitutional arithmetic of actual removal deserves precise examination because the specific numbers matter enormously for evaluating whether the documented removal pressure is anywhere near the institutional threshold that actual removal requires. Impeachment removal requires 2 sequential steps. First, a simple majority of the House must vote to approve articles of impeachment. The current House has a Republican majority. A majority House impeachment would require either Democratic control being restored or a level of Republican defection that is currently undocumented as being in progress. Second, 2/3 of the Senate, 67 senators, must vote to convict and remove. With 47 Democratic senators, 17 Republican senators would need to join them. The most bipartisan January 6th effort produced 7 Republican conviction votes. 17 is 10 more than the historic high. The gap between the historic high of 7 and the 17 needed for removal is the specific and documented institutional barrier that stands between any current removal pressure and actual removal outcomes. The 25th Amendment path has different institutional mechanics. It does not require congressional supermajorities in its first phase, but it requires the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet, all appointed by Trump and serving at his pleasure, to issue a formal declaration that the President is unable to discharge his duties. If Trump contests that declaration, which he would, both the House and the Senate would then need to vote by 2/3 supermajorities to sustain the declaration against his contest. No reporting suggests the Vice President or any cabinet member is considering 25th Amendment action. The very threshold that might seem to make the 25th Amendment more accessible than impeachment, executive branch cooperation, rather than congressional supermajority in the initial step, is precisely the threshold that is most clearly not being approached in any documented way in the current situation. Both paths to removal face significant and specific institutional barriers. Both are far from being reached based on the documented evidence. Both barriers deserve to be understood clearly and precisely for the accountability story to be evaluated honestly. The specific bundling dynamic that produces the dramatic headline format is essential to understand because it shows how dramatized content packages distributed individual calls into a unified formal demand. The format takes individual public statements made at different times in different contexts by different lawmakers, floor speeches, social media posts, public letters, press statements, op-eds, and the historical record of previous impeachment votes, and presents them as if they constitute a unified, coordinated formal group action. But a single joint demand, a formal coordinated bloc filing a specific institutional document, a unified Senate movement acting in concert toward a specific procedural outcome. The reality is different in kind from that depiction. The over 70 legislators who have called for removal represent a distributed political position, a view that is widely shared among Democratic lawmakers, but that has been expressed through individual actions in individual contexts rather than through the kind of formal coordinated group action that a joint resolution or a formally filed group demand would represent. A formal joint demand signed by 40 senators and filed as a specific formal institutional action would be significant in ways that the distributed individual calls are not, because it would represent the formal organization of a specific bloc with specific procedural implications for how the Senate would be expected to respond institutionally. The distributed individual calls represent political pressure. A formal joint demand would represent institutional action. Understanding that distinction between the political pressure that the documented calls actually represent and the formal institutional action that the headline implies has occurred is the most important analytical move for anyone trying to evaluate what the removal pressure wave has actually produced and what would need to happen for it to produce more. Now let's examine the 25th Amendment mechanism specifically in more depth, because the shift from impeachment framing to 25th Amendment framing in the most recent removal calls is itself constitutionally significant and reflects a specific evolution in how Trump's most vocal critics are constructing the constitutional case for his removal. The January 6th removal demands were primarily framed as impeachment arguments that Trump had committed specific high crimes and misdemeanors through his incitement of the Capitol attack and his efforts to prevent the certification of the election results. Those arguments invoked Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, and required a finding of specific criminal or constitutional misconduct. The current Iran-triggered removal demands are more explicitly invoking Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, a mechanism specifically designed for situations where the president is unable to discharge the duties of the office, rather than where the president has committed specific high crimes. That constitutional shift reflects a specific argument that what is at issue with Trump's Iran conduct is not primarily criminal misconduct, but fitness, the ability to discharge the duties of the office without endangering the country through language, conduct, and decision-making that the 25th Amendment is specifically designed to address. Senator Markey, citing Trump's own statements as evidence of unfitness, is making that specific constitutional argument. The whole civilization will die language, the contradiction of blessing the same civilization in the same post, the Iran messaging chaos, those are being presented as fitness evidence rather than criminal conduct evidence. Whether that evidence actually meets the 25th Amendment's constitutional standard is a question that the mechanism's own text says is primarily for the Vice President and Cabinet to answer, which is precisely why the practical path to 25th Amendment removal is so steep when neither the Vice President nor any Cabinet member has indicated they are considering using the mechanism. The broader pattern of removal pressure across Trump's political career, from the Ukraine impeachment through January 6th through the current Iran wave, tells you about the constitutional accountability mechanisms and their structural limitations in the current political environment. Trump has now faced two actual House impeachments, one on Ukraine abuse of power and one on January 6th incitement, and a sustained wave of removal demands in the current Iran context. Each impeachment produced a guilty verdict from the majority of senators who voted. Neither produced the two-thirds threshold for conviction. The structural barrier, the Senate two-thirds threshold, has held through the most serious accountability crises of Trump's political career. The question that the current wave of removal demands is asking whether Iran-related conduct and fitness concerns can overcome the structural barrier that capital attack accountability could not, is a question that the constitutional arithmetic makes very difficult to answer affirmatively in the current political configuration. The removal pressure is genuine. The structural barrier is also genuine. Understanding both simultaneously, without either the dramatic framing or the purely performative dismissal, is what gives you the most accurate picture of where the accountability situation actually stands. There are three things that matter most about the removal pressure story and what it actually means for where the constitutional accountability of this presidency stands, and every one of them deserves to land with complete clarity. The first point is about what the precise documented numbers, over 70 legislators, including several senators, actually establish as a political and institutional benchmark, and how understanding those numbers precisely and placing them against the constitutional thresholds gives you the most accurate available picture of where the removal pressure stands. Over 70 total legislators calling for removal is a real and documented number that represents a genuine institutional expression of removal pressure going beyond normal partisan opposition. Calling for the most extreme constitutional mechanisms of presidential removal is not routine political opposition. It is a specific formal constitutional claim that conduct has crossed a threshold requiring the most serious available institutional response. But the composition of that 70-plus matters enormously for evaluating its institutional significance. Mostly House members, several senators, not 40 senators. And even 40 senators would be less than the 67 needed for conviction, and an entirely different institutional category from the vice presidential and cabinet majority that the 25th Amendment requires in its first phase. The accurate numbers tell a more complex and more honest story than the dramatized claim. They tell you that the removal pressure is real and politically significant, while the institutional threshold for actual removal is very far from being reached by the current documented pressure. Both of those things are true. Both deserve to be understood clearly. Neither the dramatic amplification nor the dismissive minimization gives you the complete accurate picture that the documented record supports. The second point is about what the constitutional shift from impeachment to 25th Amendment framing in the current removal calls tells you about the evolution of the constitutional case being made and why that shift matters for evaluating both the argument and the practical path to removal. The shift from impeachment to 25th Amendment reflects a specific constitutional evolution. Impeachment says the president committed high crimes and misdemeanors, specific conduct that requires congressional action. 25th Amendment Section 4 says the president is unable to discharge the duties of the office, a fitness determination that requires executive cooperation from the vice president and cabinet before Congress acts. The practical path that the 25th Amendment argument requires is a path that depends on the very people appointed by and serving at the pleasure of the president deciding to act against him. The probability of that path being taken without a genuinely catastrophic change in political and factual circumstances, something more acute than the documented current removal pressure has produced, is very low based on everything we know about how the vice president and the cabinet are currently positioned. Understanding that the 25th Amendment path is constitutionally distinct from impeachment and practically even more demanding in its initial threshold is understanding why the current removal pressure, however genuine and significant, faces institutional barriers that the dramatic headline obscures. The third point is about what the full historical arc of removal pressure, the Ukraine impeachment, the January 6th effort, and the current Iran wave, tells you about whether the constitutional accountability mechanisms are structurally capable of producing actual removal in the current political environment, and what would realistically need to change for that outcome to become possible. The January 6th removal effort was the best possible case for actual removal in terms of bipartisan support and the severity of the triggering conduct, a capital attack. The most bipartisan House impeachment vote ever. The most bipartisan Senate conviction vote ever. 7 Republican senators, and still 10 votes short of the threshold. The current Iran wave is generating pressure that is smaller, less bipartisan, and less institutionally developed than January 6th. The threshold that the most serious effort in history could not reach is further away from the current wave than it was from January 6th. That does not make the current pressure insignificant as a political force. Political pressure that falls short of institutional outcomes can still shape the landscape, raise the cost of defending Trump's conduct, build a public record of institutional concern, and create the conditions that might eventually change the political arithmetic. But it does mean that any evaluation of the removal pressure that does not acknowledge how far the current situation is from the institutional threshold for actual removal is giving an incomplete and potentially misleading picture. More than 70 Democratic lawmakers, including several senators, publicly called for Trump's removal through impeachment or the 25th Amendment following his Iran threats and civilization destruction language. Major news organizations reported specifically that over 70 legislators, including several senators, urged the cabinet to invoke the 25th in Congress to reconvene for impeachment. Over 70 Democratic lawmakers have called for Trump's removal via impeachment or the 25th Amendment following his Iran threats, with Senator Markey explicitly citing unfitness. During the January 6th fallout, at least 90 Democrats supported removal, producing the most bipartisan impeachment vote, but still 10 votes short of the two-thirds threshold. No formal coordinated removal process is currently in motion. The pressure is real and constitutionally serious, but the gap to actual removal remains significant.